Why you can't find the Buddha in books. There's a principle that the things you know best are the things you do, the things you make. If you're a builder, you've had experience building houses, ordination halls. You see another house, you see another ordination hall, and you have an appreciation for what was done. If you're a writer, you see someone else do a really good piece of writing and you recognize why it's good. Of course, the things you actually do yourself, you know those very well. You can look at every detail. I did this, I did that. This is how this fits together. The problem is that we do certain things so continuously, so frequently, that we're no longer conscious of what we're doing. As the Buddha pointed out, we construct our experience of the present moment through the way we breathe, through the way we talk to ourselves, through the feelings we focus on, the perceptions we use. In other words, the mental labels and images we use to identify things. We use these processes, what he calls fabrications, to put together the raw material that comes from our past karma. We're doing it all the time, but as the Buddha explains, we do it in ignorance, so we're barely aware of it. That's why we don't get the best results out of it. One of the reasons why we meditate is to become more conscious of these processes. As you're trying to get the mind into a state of concentration, you have to use those same processes to gather around your object. To begin with, you've got the breath that you're focusing on. Where in the body are you feeling it right now? Focus your attention there. Try to keep it there. That's going to require that you talk to yourself about it. In other words, if you notice that the mind is wandering off, you remind yourself to come right back. Then you try to figure out ways to keep it here. Ajahn Lee gives some good examples. Think of the breath not just as the air coming in and out through the nose, but also as the flow of energy through the body. Where do you feel that? Can it be comfortable? Is there a way of breathing that makes it comfortable? Short or long, fast or slow, deep, shallow, or in long, out short, in short, out long? Talk to yourself about this. And don't just talk, of course. Experiment. This will require that you use certain perceptions, certain images of how the breath flows in the body. Which images are most useful? Try to think of your experience of the body right now as totally breath. If there's any sense of blockage, remind yourself that the breath was there first, and it can still flow. So it doesn't have to tense up here to push its way through, or to detour over there. It can flow easily through the body, easily as you breathe in, easily as you breathe out. In this way, you can create a feeling of ease. You become more conscious that this is how you put an experience together in the present moment. Then you begin to notice how you do it at other times of the day as well. And you notice that a lot of the ways that you process your experience of the world have a lot of identification around them. Your way of doing things. This is the part of you that has an instinctive sense that, yes, you are constructing your experience. You're not just sitting here watching things happen on their own without any participation on your part. You're playing a role. And you tend to identify yourself with the things that you do well or things that come easily to you. But some of the things you do well may not necessarily be really skillful. We do greed well. We do anger well. Delusion. We're experts. And we have a very strong sense of self around these things. It's just the way I am. It comes naturally. In fact, you don't even think that you're doing it so much. It just comes. But actually, you are putting these things together. Selves with skills. One of the important insights of the meditation is that even though you may be good at these things and you have an instinctive sense of how to play these games, it's not always good to be playing them. There are better ways of putting the present moment together. We're kind of like beavers. Beavers go into a forest, and their idea of what's missing in the forest is a lodge in a pond along with a dam to create the pond. They've done studies of beavers who were orphaned as little tiny kits, brought into captivity and raised by human beings. The question was, would they be able to build their dams and their lodges without having experienced those things in the wild? Well, sure enough, when they were released into the forest, that was the first thing they did. Build a lodge, build a dam, create a lake. That's the way we are too. We instinctively do a process that the Buddha calls becoming. We get a sense of something we want, then we identify the world in which that desired object exists, and then we take on a role in that world. The role we assume has a lot to do with our sense of our skills. If you're good at anger, good at greed, good at aversion, good at delusion, they'll be part of the identity you take on. The Buddha wants to teach you that there are other ways of doing things, but the first thing he does is to have you build a better sense of becoming. He talks about what he calls the 4 bases for success. They describe how we succeed in putting a state of concentration together based on desire, persistence, intent, and your powers of analysis. And just as we tend to identify with whatever skills we already have and tend to use, the Buddha wants to teach you how to create a state of concentration, and it doesn't matter that you create a sense of identity around the steps that get you there. In fact, it's going to be necessary. Just learn how to do it well. The desire has to do with your sense of you as the person who's going to enjoy the results of what you're doing. This is a large part of your motivation. You hear people in some schools of meditation saying that they meditate without any purpose, without any goal. It's as if they're showing off. But maybe that's their purpose. They're meditating to show off. We're here because we have a purpose. That's the nature of the mind. It's always got a purpose or purposes of some sort. So you think about what a good goal it would be to find something inside that doesn't change. A happiness that doesn't disappoint or require that you do anything ignoble. And it doesn't even require maintenance. It doesn't depend on anybody suffering. Nobody's harmed by this. That's a good goal. The Buddha talks about that as delighting in the unafflicted, delighting in seclusion, and delighting in what he calls non-objectification. In other words, a goal that doesn't involve a sense of identity. You realize the identities you take on are all strategies. Once you've reached the goal, you can put the strategies aside and there's no conflict. So use that sense of the goal even though, by necessity, it's going to be very sketchy. As the Buddha said, there's no way you can anticipate what Nibbana is going to be like before you really hit it. He gives you some general ideas, but he says that those are just arrows pointing in that direction. It's the ultimate bliss, freedom, a state of consciousness that doesn't depend on anything. It's a truth. You can rely on it. It's not going to change. And it's the ultimate. There's nothing better. Everything else in the world exists for the sake of something else. But here, there's no for the sake of anything. It's totally arrived. So think about that as where you're going. And if you have any idea that you'll be disappointed when you get there, the Buddha says that's wrong view. So have some confidence in this desire and do your best to create a sense of how much you would enjoy that. That's you as the consumer. The next step is persistence. You realize you can't just sit here and want this to come. As the Buddha said, the desire for there to be no aging, illness, and death, if you just sit there and desire it, is going to be suffering. But if you act on the proper path, you actually find that you can attain what you desire. That's you as the producer, you as the agent. Here you take delight in developing skillful qualities and abandoning unskillful ones. A large part of your identity as an agent lies in that delight. You enjoy doing these things. If it doesn't come naturally, you learn how to make it more natural because that's an important part of wisdom. There are a lot of things that give good long-term results, but you may not like to do them. Yet if you have any sense, any discernment at all, you'll talk yourself into wanting to do them. The same with the things that you would like to do, but give bad results. You learn to talk yourself into not wanting to do them. The Buddha's discernment is strategic. We're not here just to accept things and be okay. We're here to figure things out, and especially to figure out our own likes and dislikes. to learn how to train our likes in the right direction. So, learn how to enjoy that particular identity as well. The agent who wants to do this, who delights in being persistent, who delights in whatever is required by the path. Then there's the self as the observer. That goes with intent. You really want to pay careful attention to what you're doing. It is possible to follow the Buddha's instructions without really paying careful attention, but you're not going to learn much. The Buddha never said that you can gain awakening simply by following steps A, B, C, D. The path requires that you put in your own willingness to really observe all around what you're doing. That's you as the observer. And finally, there's you as the commentator. This goes with analysis. When you've done something, ask yourself, how good are the results? This analysis requires a value judgment. Sometimes you hear it said that the Buddha doesn't want you to pass judgment on things. Just accept them as they are. There's inconstancy in life, and there's stress in life, and there's a lot of stuff that's just not you, that you can't control, so just accept it and be okay with it. The Buddha never said that. That's taking the three characteristics and making them the main issue. The main issue is actually in the Four Noble Truths, starting with the fact that we suffer in our clinging. We cling because of craving, and we crave because of ignorance. However, it is possible to put an end to that ignorance, put an end to that craving, by following the path. These are truths that carry duties. The suffering is to be comprehended. The craving and the ignorance are to be abandoned. The goal is to be realized, and that's done by following and developing the path. That's the framework for our analysis. Then, you look at what you've done. How does it measure up? Are there things you should be developing that you haven't developed yet? Are there things you should be abandoning that you haven't abandoned yet? When you get really good at this, you're not just passing judgment, you're also making suggestions. This is the self as commentator, which sends its messages back to the agent. How about trying this? How about trying that? If your commentator is nothing but an inner critic, this isn't good enough. That's not good enough. But without offering suggestions, you really need to train that inner critic. Just tell it. If you can't offer anything positive, can't offer any other options, then I'm not going to listen to you. Because you still want to maintain that desire, you as the consumer, and you want to develop that sense of competence in you as that agent. So you as the observer and the commentator go very closely together. When you develop them well, you're developing these bases for success: the desire, the persistence, intent, and your powers of analysis. As you get better and better at this, you find that you've got some new selves inside, defined around these bases for success. These are the selves you want to encourage. As for the selves that are really good at greed, aversion, and delusion, ask yourself, do you really want to continue identifying with them? You've got something better inside. That's one of the principles of the Buddha's teachings all around. If he's asking you to give up something, it's not to deprive you of anything that's really necessary or really good. It's because he's got better things to offer. So you want to learn how to identify with the desire for the path, the desire for the goal. Identify with the willingness to do what's needed, to be persistent in abandoning anything that's going to get in the way, developing things that will move you further. Identify with the observer, to be really, really observant, and with the inner commentator, the analyst, who both passes judgment on what's done and then tries to figure out if something's wrong, what you can do to improve it. In the beginning, because you're not good at these skills, it's going to require a lot of pep talks and a lot of encouragement. But as you get better and better, and it becomes more natural, it really does feel more and more like you, the meditator. It's an identity that becomes more and more second nature. The time will come when you have to put it down, but in the meantime, use it. All these roles of the new you. As you see how you're putting all this together and getting really skilled at it, the skill is what confirms the sense of wanting to identify with this path. It's hard in the beginning when the path doesn't go as smoothly as you'd like, and you keep on thinking, there are other things I can do more easily, other things I can do better. But you have to remind yourself, this is the skill. These are the identities you want to develop. So take heart. There are some people who say they can't imagine themselves attaining any of the noble attainments. The response to that is, you get changed by the path. You'll become a different you. It's like learning a foreign language. Depending on the nature of the language and the people who teach it to you, you find that you develop a new personality in that language, and it's just as much you as your personality in your original language. So develop the personality of a meditator until you get really fluent at it. To know the Buddha. I've mentioned before the results of research that was done back in the early part of the 20th century, observing infants, finding that what gives infants the greatest happiness is not so much hugging them or giving them pleasant sensations. It's when they realize they can do something and get a result. They do it again and get the same result. You notice that when they make a noise that they repeat over and over again. It drives you crazy, but they're happy because they see that they have agency. That's the beginning of developing a skill. Psychologists have noticed, lots of people, philosophers, the Buddha, have all noticed that what makes us happy is what we do, when we do it well. The pleasures that come from the senses, nice sounds, smells, tastes, tactile senses, don't give us nearly as much happiness as when we've mastered a skill. It's good to think about this. When we think about the Buddha's analysis of suffering, it's the mirror image. He defines suffering, dukkha, stress, pain, as the 5 clinging aggregates. Now, the act of clinging is an action, and the aggregates themselves are actions, even the body. As they say in Pali, rupa rupati, which means form deforms. Feelings feel, perceptions perceive, fabrications fabricate, consciousness cognizes. They're not things. When we talk about them as aggregates, it sounds as if they're piles of gravel, but they're actually activities. And the activity itself is suffering, stress. We do these things for the sake of happiness. We cling to them, and yet they cause suffering. In fact, the clinging and the doing is suffering in and of itself, in the same way that the doing of a skill is happy. This is why the discernment that the Buddha taught may start with the words he taught, but those words point to actions. When he points us to where we can look to understand happiness, where we can look to understand suffering, what we can do to understand how we're creating suffering and how we don't have to, he's teaching a skill. He illustrates his skills with analogies of other people who have skills. Cooks who know how to read the sign of their master, as he says. Archers who know how to shoot far distances, shoot in rapid succession, pierce great masses, even trained elephants, trained horses. What we're doing is all about mastering a skill. So, we hear what the Buddha has to say and we think it through. The hearing is the discernment that comes from listening, thinking about it, and trying to reason it through to see if it makes sense is the discernment that comes from thinking. But then, there's the discernment that comes from developing, when we actually develop in our actions the qualities he talks about. We can read about mindfulness. We can think about how mindfulness works together with ardency and alertness. We can come to certain conclusions. But the actual fact of being mindful and being mindful again, and then learning how to extend your mindfulness, to give it a good foundation, being alert at the same time, being ardent at the same time, how these factors work together. That's a skill you have to develop. And it's in developing the skill that we get in touch with what the Buddha was all about. He left behind the words, but the words were simply pointers. I was reading today someone saying that we can't trust the various Buddhist traditions. We have to depend on historians using the historical critical method to tell us how little we know about what the Buddha had to say. and to justify changing the Dharma as we go from one generation to another, saying that the Buddha is beyond our reach. We can't really know what he actually said. All we know is what his disciples, generation after generation, said about what he said. But that's not why we're interested in Buddhism. We're interested in Buddhism because it promises an end to suffering. It teaches us a skill, and that skill doesn't change. It's the same skill in the time of the Buddha as it is now. We're told sometimes that we can add new dimensions to the teachings of the Four Noble Truths. For example, the Buddha never talked about social systems and the suffering they cause, but maybe we can add that to the tradition by talking about systemic suffering. Well, he obviously saw that there were problems in the social system then, but that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was craving and clinging. Those things are the same now as they were then. And we can recreate that skill. We can master that skill inside us. When we get the results, that's when we get in contact with what the Buddha found. It's like recovering old manual skills. They've been doing analyses of Roman concrete. It turns out that Roman concrete is pretty amazing. The Pantheon was made out of concrete, and look at it. This huge dome that hasn't fallen down after many centuries. If it had been made out of the concrete that we usually use now, it would have been dust by now. Through trial and error, they've learned to recreate the original recipe. They've analyzed what was in there, and they've found that the Romans added some unusual things to their concrete to make it so strong. So, skills like that can be recovered. We may not be able to recover the Buddha's precise words, but we can recover his skill. Take the sutta on setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion. Sometimes it reads as if it were just an outline of what the Buddha had to say. The Buddha mentions the 5 aggregates but doesn't define what they are in the sutta, so maybe he actually did define what they were when he gave the talk reported in the sutta. That part may be beyond recovery, but the skill isn't beyond recovery. It's the part of the Dhamma that's deathless. So, if you want to know the Buddha, try to master this skill. He talks about how you relate to your breath. It's something very immediate. It's right here in your body. He talks about what you can learn by learning how to breathe aware of the whole body, learning how to calm the breath, learning how to breathe in ways that give rise to rapture, pleasure, to breathe in ways that allow you to be sensitive to how feelings have an impact on the mind, how your perceptions have an impact on the mind, and how you can calm that effect. These are all part of his skill, so you go through the effort that's required to master this skill. As he said, it basically comes down to commitment and reflection, and then he expands on that when he defines the 4 bases for success. The commitment starts with desire. You really want to do it, so you learn how to focus your desires in such a way that they don't get in the way. All too often, it's easy to focus so much on what we want out of this that we forget to pay careful attention to really wanting to do it right. It's a meticulous job, like those movies of prison breaks. You have to be very careful, step by step. You can't rush the steps, but of course, you don't want to be too slow. So you're meticulous in focusing your desire in the right place, i.e., on the causes. Then you put forth the effort, whatever is required, and you pay careful attention to what you're doing. This is the beginning of the reflection. It's not that you do and then look. You look while you're doing, and then you look at the results. The reflection doesn't stop with just looking and being sensitive to what you're doing and the results. This is where the 4th factor comes in, which Ajahn Lee translates as circumspection. But it covers all your mental activities that analyze if something goes wrong. Okay, what went wrong? Then you use your ingenuity to figure out, if it's wrong, what would be a better way to try to tackle this? Then you use your desire again to come up with an ingenious alternative and then to test it through your efforts. These bases for success go around and around like this. They hover around your actions so that you do become skillful. And the act of becoming skillful in and of itself is pleasant. As you get a better and better sense of how you can breathe, talk to yourself, focus on feelings and perceptions, putting things together in a better and better way, you start using these aggregates as a fruitful path rather than as an unsuccessful path. That's why clinging to the aggregates is suffering, because the clinging is acting on them, using them, in ways where you're not really getting the results you want. There's a sense of frustration. You're putting in the effort and you're not getting the results. That's the suffering. So when you start putting in the effort and you do start getting results, that's happiness. It's a happiness that goes deeper than just the pleasure of having a comfortable breath and allowing the comfort to expand. That's part of it. But more important is the sense that you know how to do this. And with time, you begin to realize you can do it again and again and again, like the infant making a noise again and again. But now you're doing something that's actually useful. You're exercising your agency in solving an important problem. And there's a sense of pleasure that comes with that. There's an even greater pleasure that comes when you begin to realize that the things you used to hold on to, used to cling to, used to do again and again and again, are totally unnecessary. You don't need them anymore. That's what dispassion is all about. Dispassion gets a bad rap in our society. It sounds dull and lifeless. But basically, it means that you learn to outgrow your old bad habits. You used to shoot cocaine, but now you realize you don't have to do it anymore. You can find happiness in a way that's healthy, so you're totally dispassionate for your old addiction. You're free. The Buddha keeps pairing the word dispassion with words for freedom, escape, being unfettered. That's the ultimate skill. And it comes as you get better and better in judging what you're doing, the results you're getting, what's satisfactory and what's not. So, this is how we get to know the Buddha, through recreating his skill. He gives the formula, and we can follow it. It's just like the people who can make Roman cement again. We can rediscover the path within ourselves. We can find freedom within ourselves. And that's the Dhamma that's really worth knowing. Bases for success. When we built the Citta, the spired monument at Wat Dhammasatit, inside it we placed a rock. On the top surface of the rock was a sculpted Buddha's footprint. On the side of the rock, Ajahn Fuang had the word in Thai for the 4 bases for success, Iddhipada, carved into the rock. Now, part of the reason was that there was a play on words. The word for footprint or foot, pada, is also the word for base. But another part of the reason was that the 4 bases for success were what enabled us to build the Citta. As Ajahn Fuang said, without them, nothing would have happened there. It'd still be an empty hillside, but because of them, the Citta was established. As the Buddha himself said of his own case, his powers as a Buddha were established on the basis for success. And because they're related directly to the practice of concentration, it's good to think about them. In Thailand, they like to apply them to every aspect of any endeavor. When you finish your education, the Thai idiom is that you succeed in your education. So they talk about the 4 bases of success as being necessary to finish your education. But in the canon, they're specifically related to concentration. And as we remember, concentration is the heart of the path. If you neglect these bases for success, the Buddha says, you're neglecting the noble path as a whole. So it's good to keep them in mind. There's the base of success, which is concentration founded on desire and the fabrications of exertion. There's the base of success, which is concentration founded on persistence and the fabrications of exertion. The fabrication of exertion is there in each case. It basically means right effort. The other 2 bases are concentration founded on intent and concentration founded on circumspection. That makes it sound like there are 4 different kinds of concentration, but in each case, you've got right effort involved, and right effort involves desire, intent, and persistence. To be right, you also have to have some discernment into what is skillful and what's not. So the difference among the four bases seems to be more a question of emphasis as to which factor is going to be strongest in your concentration, because all four have to be present. You see them all in the factors for the first stage of right concentration, the first jhana. Desire. You're thinking largely about the pleasure and rapture that are going to come when the mind settles down. But of course, for desire to be properly focused, it has to be focused on the causes. If you focus simply on the results, you can sit here and think for hours about how much you'd like to have the results, but they're never going to come. They won't have any foundation, so you've got to focus on your efforts. In this case, the effort is to have singleness of mind, or cittassa ekagata. Sometimes this term is translated as one-pointedness of mind, but there's nothing in the term that refers to point. When the Buddha gives his analogies for concentration, they're always expansive and always mention a full-body awareness. When the rapture and pleasure come, you let them fill the whole body. You work them through the body in the same way that a person making dough for bread would work the moisture through the flour. So we're not after one-pointedness, we're after singleness. One single perception, one single object filling the range of your awareness. In this case, it would be the breath filling the body, and that's the one thing you're working on. That's what the effort is all about. Any hindrances that come up, in other words, anything that would distract you from this one object, you've got to put aside. You do everything you can to keep the mind with the breath. This is where you bring in citta, or intentness, which is basically the same thing as directed thought. You don't think randomly. Your thoughts are directed, and you keep the mind on one topic. You give your full attention to this one topic. Then finally, you bring in Vīmaṃsā, which refers to the mind's discursive, discerning faculties. Ajahn Lee translates it as circumspection. It can also be translated as your analytical qualities and your ingenuity, the active part of the mind that's looking, thinking, and evaluating. This, of course, is related to evaluation as a factor for right concentration. As you're trying to stay focused on one thing, you're paying full attention to that one thing, and you use your discernment to evaluate. How well is it going? There's a dialogue between the directed thought and evaluation. You focus on the question, is the mind settling down? If it's not settling down, where is the problem? Is the problem with the breath or with the mind? Sometimes you direct your thoughts straight at the breath. Sometimes you have to focus back on the mind. Then you evaluate what's going on. Is the mind ready to settle down? If it's too anxious, what can you do to get it more settled? If it has too much energy, what can you do to calm it down? If it has too little energy, what can you do to energize it? This is the work of evaluation, working on this as a skill and seeing it as a problem that you want to think through. Meditation does require thinking. It's like a carpenter trying to fit two pieces of wood together so that they're perfectly snug. Sometimes you sand this piece of wood. Sometimes you sand that piece of wood. Try to fit them together. If they don't fit quite right together, you take them apart and sand them down again. You're sanding either this piece, the breath, or that piece, the mind, until they're just right for each other. Then you put them together. That's when the mind becomes one. Then you can do what you can to maintain that. Now, as you maintain it, the more active side, the discerning side, becomes less and less active. You don't need to do so much directed thought and evaluation. There's simply the effort to stay with one object at the same time that you're enjoying the rapture and the pleasure. If the rapture and the pleasure seem too much, you can let them go, and there's simply equanimity. In this way, the mind settles down the way you want it to. You have some success in your meditation. You often hear it said that there are no good meditations or bad meditations, that you're not supposed to judge your meditation, but that's not how the Buddha taught. The quality of Vīmaṃsā basically entails your powers of judgment and recognition of the fact that meditation is a skill. It is something you master. When it doesn't go well, you try to figure out why it's not going well. When it does go well, you try to maintain it. Without engaging in too much thought, you try to figure out why it's going well and how it can go better. So it is possible to succeed in meditation. That's why we're here. It is a skill that can be mastered. And as you master the skill, you find that you bring all the elements of the path together. Right view in seeing that the training of the mind is going to make the difference between suffering and not suffering. Right resolve. You decide you want to find happiness in a way that doesn't involve sensuality, doesn't involve ill will, doesn't involve any harmfulness. You've got it right here with the concentration. Right speech in this case would be the speech of directed thought and evaluation as you talk to yourself about the breath. Right action, right livelihood, everything you do to give rise to a sense of well-being. That provides the food for the mind. Right mindfulness is keeping your object in mind. And there you are, right concentration with all of its requisites. It's in this way that following the basis for success helps to bring the Noble Eightfold Path together, and the Noble Eightfold Path makes the practice complete, all centered on your breath and on the mind right here. Because that's where the problem is, that's where the solution is going to be found, and it's in getting firmly established right here that you're in the right place, both to understand the problem and to figure out the solution, because this is where those qualities of Vīmaṃsā, your powers of judgment, do their work. First, they do their work in getting the mind to settle down. Then, they rest as the mind settles down more and more fully. Then, they're brought back to figure out where there is still any stress here in this solid state of mind, in this practice of concentration. Because after all, it is fabricated, and we're looking for something unfabricated. So you use your powers of judgment to figure that out. It's in this way that the basis for success help you to succeed not only in getting the mind concentrated, but also in solving the bigger problem of why it is that the mind, even though it wants happiness, keeps creating suffering for itself. When that problem is solved, then the work is done.